Good morning, everyone. Welcome all of you joining the public presentation organized by the Occupational Health Center. Today's topic is about hearing loss prevention program management. We are so pleased to have Norma McCormick. She is from the Corporate Health Works Inc. to present it to us. So for beginning of this section, we would like to have the land acknowledgement. Today, we would like to acknowledge that we are presenting this section on the Treaty 1 territory, where the Occupational Health Center is located, and the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Greek, OG Greek, Dakotas, and Diné peoples, and the homelands of Métis nations. Occupational Health Center acknowledge that we are all treaty people, and we recognize the history and impacts of colonization on Indigenous peoples. We commit ourselves to active accountability, justice, equity, and reconciliation. For some of the folks doesn't know about Occupational Health Center, we located on 167 Sherbrooke Street, Winnipeg, Manitoba here. We are the community health center funded by the Winnipeg Regional Health Authorities. So we provide the services to the Manitoba workers with work-related health issues and work closely with joint workplace health and safety committees for training. Our service is all free, and please visit our website for more information and resources. I could put our website link here later on. I would like to just read a short bio of Norma. Norma McCormick has been involved in standards development at the national and international level for over 40 years. And Norma has participated in chair and several CSA technical committees and lead the Canadian delegation to two ISO technical committees for like the occupational health and safety management system, and also the psychological health and safety in the workplace. For her volunteer contribution to standards development to CSA, Norma also received a CSA award for merit. So you can see that presentation is going to be recorded now, and then we will going to sharing this afterward, and also with the slide as well. And for the, if you have any question, you could put it on the chat area. Then Norma we're going to try to answer those questions after her presentation. Now, please join me to welcome Norma.
Thanks, Tiffany. So in the simplest terms, this hearing loss prevention program management, and I'm going to use the acronym just HLPP because it's a lot of words to jumble together. The essence of this standard is to find noise, measure workers' exposure to it, remove as much of the noise as is possible, controlling the noise that you can't remove, and then protecting workers from whatever cannot be engineered or managed away. So the majority of the standards devoted to how to manage the noise, how to confirm that you're doing this effectively, that you're in fact managing it, and what to do when you're not achieving the planned results of the standard. So CSA has a rich history and of interest in noise exposure. Our standards for noise, I'll go back 50 years. Now, I just want to point something out. At the bottom, the new standard, the management system standard, has had a name change. If you look at what was the name in 2009, it was developed as a hearing conservation standard. We've now tried to refocus the attention on hearing loss prevention. So this is intended to make sure that hearing loss is prevented before it occurs and not simply reacted to. So this graphic provides an example of how CSA standards fit together. So at the top in the red, you have the management system standards. The mothership is Z45001, which is the Occupational Health and Safety Management System standard. I'll come back to that again. On the left and right in blue, in purple, we have a series of standards which are application of these standards or procedurals for how to apply what are called the Z1000 series. And in the black at the bottom are the equipment standards. So these are things, for example, the one you'd all be familiar with is the standard for safety footwear. It would be a third level standard. So with respect to Z1007, we have the hearing conservation, actually now, I just keep forgetting to change this standard, this slide, the hearing loss prevention standard at the top, and then some standards for applying the standard to measure noise and to monitor exposure. And then at the bottom, the equipment standards, the standards for hearing protectors, for how to care for and use hearing protectors, and then some a standard on hearing assessment. So Z1007 is a national standard of Canada. So in order to become a national standard of Canada, there are things that have to be met. It first of all has to be bilingual, and it has to pass scrutiny in terms of reviewing to make sure it follows the rules for standard development. It also has to be developed by a consensus process. So the technical committees who come together to develop a CSA standard represent different sectors. There's what's called a balanced matrix. So labor, academia, experts in a specific field, and people with a general interest come together and then develop and vote on a standard. So that process has to be followed and documented before it can become a national standard of Canada. So the CSA Z1002 is a management system standard, and it integrates hearing loss prevention with other management system standards that all follow the Plan, Do, Check, Act model. So at the bottom in the circle, you see Z45001. That's the national standard that we have adopted from the ISO standard. And then a range of standards that we call the Z1000 series, which deal with a variety of health and safety topics. So this standard, this slide then identifies them. So here we are at hearing loss prevention 1007. The other ones are the emergency management standard. This is Z1600, a standard on OSH training, on risk control. Z1003 is psychological health and safety in the workplace, the workplace ergonomic standard, incident investigation, et cetera, et cetera. So this is a way of integrating different hazards and responses to hazards into a set of series that provide direction for people in the workplace to manage occupational health and safety. So this is the Plan, Do, Check, Act model, which all of the management system standards have to follow. So the idea is it's a continuous circle. You plan what you need to do, and in planning, you identify what the law requires you to do, what the hazards are in your workplace and how to manage them, and then you set objectives and targets. Then you implement what you plan to do. You then check to make sure that what you're doing is actually working, and then if there is need for improvement or if there are any gaps or deficiencies, you act, and then that takes you back into the planning cycle. So this is the approach that all of the Z1000 series take. So we'd already talked about a name change, right? So in addition to its new name, the new standard provides simple, non-technical language needed to manage an HLPP and who collects the information and gathers it. So it talks about not how to do it, but what needs to be done. So the related standards then are the hearing protection, hearing testing, the noise assessment, and hearing surveillance standards. All of these are the ones that would appear at the bottom of that chart I showed earlier. So the elements of a hearing loss prevention program then are integrated into the hearing loss prevention program. Now, we have laws in Manitoba. We have our section of the Workplace Safety and Health Regulation, which requires us to address noise as a problem. What we lack is any obligation to manage the program we put in place. So this is the advantage of overlaying the standard. And in my wildest fantasy, I would love to see our Z1000 series of standards integrated and incorporated by reference into our health and safety legislation. This gives these standards the authority or the applicability as legal requirements. Okay, so the other thing then is when you look at that broad requirement in the Workplace Safety and Health Regulation for a program, you see underneath it, we have a whole bunch of activities that are necessary. We have to assess the risk, we have to control the risk, we have to manage the environment, we have to train people, we have to investigate incidents and respond to emergencies. So all of the elements that are in our program requirements, of the 13 requirements in our legislation, exist within a hearing loss, within a scope. And hearing loss prevention then is one of the hazards that are identified and to be identified to be assessed and controlled. Okay, so now I'm going to talk specifically about the structure of the standard. And it, again, because it's a management system standard, follows the Plan, Do, Check, Act. And there's also mandatory titles for the sections in every OSH standard. So the advantage of this is that if you are working with the noise standard, you can roll over and look at the standard for managing work at heights, or for working in extreme conditions, or for your workplace disability management. You can look at any of the standards and see that they follow a parallel structure. So the structure then goes on, creates responsibilities starting in section 4 and forward, to identify the need for, and then to develop and implement the hearing loss prevention program. So there are a couple of additional sections which are not commonly found in the other management system standards. And the one I want to point to is special challenges, because there are certain challenges that exist for noise that do not exist for other OSH other OSH hazards, and I'll come back to that. So a scope for a CSA standard actually puts a fence around it. The scope is generally developed first and is approved, and then it guides the technical committee. As we're going forward developing the elements of the standard, we can refer back to the scope and say, did we intend to cover this? And if we are outside of the scope, if we've jumped over the fence, then we have to either amend the scope or we have to stay within the scope. So this really helps discipline the technical committee, because oftentimes there are people who want to load everything into a standard and are having difficulty limiting it to its scope. So again, much of the requirements that are set out in the scope are in fact necessary according to the management system standard requirements. There's also 55 definitions in the standard. Section 3 of a management system standard is always definitions. I've decided not to bore you with all 55, but I've just put down 3 here to give you an example of how these definitions work. So the definition then is identifying the term, and the term must appear in the standard in order to be defined. So we talk, for example, about audiometric tests, and that's the audiometry that people must be subjected to if they're exposed over a certain level. And that's often by jurisdiction. You know, some Canadian provinces do not require audiometry. An interesting definition of hazardous noise, you know, having had kids over the years, trying to talk to them about the noise coming out of what we used to call the Sony Walkman. Oh, that's not hazardous, Mom, it's just music, right? Anyway, so there's a definition of hazardous noise. And then one definition that is of particular interest to me is because often organizations outsource parts of their hearing loss prevention program. And when that happens, the person who provides the service on behalf of the organization still has to meet the standard. So this is a definition of service providers. Okay, now starting in 4 is the basis of the management system model. And first of all, it requires an organization to assign responsibilities, and that involves conforming with the standard. So it identifies the management organization of the organization who have specific roles and responsibilities. The first is to, and these words repeat in all management system standards, establish, implement, and maintain processes for worker participation and consultation. This is the very, very fundamental requirement in 45,001, and it continues all the way through all of CSA's Z1000 series. So management has to create the the hearing loss prevention program and assign roles, and including to a person who is responsible for administering the program. And then it's also management's responsibility to control hazardous noise. So when we start talking about that program administrator, their obligation is not to control the noise, but to make sure that the management strategies for controlling noise are in fact in place and working. Providing workers with HPDs, hearing protection devices, there's another acronym I'll be using again and again, and training and resources and tools to follow the requirements of the standard. And then reporting on the performance of the standard to stakeholders. So these are the requirements that management of the organization has. Then they identify as part of their responsibility the program administrator, who is responsible for oversight of the program. So this person then has the obligation to make sure that the management requirements and resources are in fact implemented. So this person then has to be provided with authority and resources to implement the program, correct deficiencies, eliminate hazardous noise or control risk, and enforce compliance with the HLPP. Now, this is another interesting thing. When you start to think about it, this person has what we would call not line control, but staff control across the organization. So this person, it's worth thinking how this person would relate to supervisors in a workplace. So if a person has an area where hearing protection is required and there's a gap or deficiency in the use of hearing protection, it's important to understand that the administrator does not have the authority to go to that supervisor and demand the supervisor ensure their supervisory duties, but that they comply with the requirements of the hearing loss prevention program. So this is just an interesting sort of way in which these words have been thought through carefully. So the hearing loss, the administrator then has to make sure that the people who are assigned responsibility or tasks in the workplace are qualified to do so. So for example, an audiometric technician has to hold a license. The people who do sound level surveys have to be competent to do that, and also have to have equipment that is properly tested and maintained. So this again goes on A through, I believe it's H. Yes, the responsibilities of this administrator. So the audiometric testing is a specific section under the regulation under clause 8, and there is a standard, CSA Z1076, which is the standard which governs audiometric testing. There's also a requirement for hazard communication signage. So there's a section on hazard communication, and a requirement that all persons exposed to hazardous noise receive training and education. And when we get to clause 10, it talks about the importance of training and education for all aspects of the standard. There's also a requirement for documentation and records that are set out in clause 11. So this record keeping requirement goes back to the administrator. So again, here's a note. If some of the functions, which is common with audiometric testing, are outsourced, the administrator has to provide oversight to make sure that the services meet the requirements. So because we do this as part of our practice at Corporate HealthWorks, I would hope that people would be asking us, if they're contracting with us, for proof that our audiometric technicians have current licenses to be performing the audiometry, and also that they would ask us for proof that our audiometers and our noise measurement equipment, our dosimeters, are properly calibrated. So I'm, waiting for the world to change in this direction. We're capable of providing it and just wish we were asked more for this. So again, every management system standard has an orientation to what's called continuous improvement. So the administrator is responsible for doing the evaluation activities, examining the procedures, demonstrating that workers are incompetent to meet their responsibilities under the standard, and that when problems are found, that they are corrected. So this is, again, the continuous improvement. So there's a requirement in legislation to review the program on a regular basis. And again, this is going back to the management system standard, reviewing against the goals and objectives that were set in the planning phase. And then making sure that the performance is communicated to the participants, to OSH committees and worker representatives. So again, there's an obligation to share the outcome. Now, here's another interesting aspect of the standard. The standard puts duties on management and duties on the program administrator who acts on behalf of management. But the standard cannot put duties on workers. So the way of getting around this is to make it an expectation, and it's, again, not an enforceable aspect of this standard. Workers could not be held in default or of complying with the standards, but it's created as an expectation that workers will report to their supervisor about changes in the noise level, any change to the use of their hearing protection devices, or anything that could change or affect control measures. So this is, again, an expectation placed on workers to participate at the appropriate level in the prevention program. So at point 5, after we've done in 4, set out duties and responsibilities, we move on to clause 5, where we start implementing the things that are required to be done. And one is to detect hazards and assess risks. So there's some excellent stuff in part 5 with respect to identifying noise sources. And there are some annexes which occur at the end of the standard, which provide some very useful direction on how to do some of these things. So it talks about the requirement for noise quantification, except by means of a noise survey, and that is found in part 11, and then noise exposure measurement, which has to be done in accordance with the CSAZ 10756. So this is basically it's a graphic to show how things fit together, how these the requirements fit together and link to the processes in the workplace for accomplishing compliance with the standard. So once the hazard is detected, the noise source is identified, the next step is to go on and assess the risk. And at this point in time, you're assessing the risk to workers. So how many workers are present in the noise field? and what is the nature of the noise that they are exposed to. So here again is a link to another of the CSA Z1000 series. There is a Z1002, which is the Hazard Identification and Elimination and Risk Assessment and Control Standard. So links across to another of the management system standard. And also there's another annex in this standard, which provides some very useful methods for assessing comparative risk. And so this is helpful, is the noise impact noise, or is it continuous? So there's some very valuable information in Annex G. So when it comes to Clause 6, we're talking about controlling the noise exposure. So again, the whole principle of controlling noise is also prevention. So what can you do to prevent bringing noise into the workplace? And one is at the design stage to choose equipment, machinery, systems, and workplaces that are designed to be safety, sort of a buy quiet program. Then is to implement the hierarchy of controls. Again, these are at the control measure, where you're trying to address the noise that you have not been able to engineer or to design out, to eliminate, substitute, and control by engineering controls or administrative controls. And then at the bottom of the hierarchy, to implement the requirement for personal protective equipment, which is the hearing protection devices. And there is a section in Clause 6 on engineering controls, talking about how to isolate or enclose noise to prevent worker exposure. Then section 6.4, Clause 6.4 moves to administrative controls, which talk about the kinds of ways in which you can administer, reduce worker exposure, for example, by scheduling of work, by job rotation, limiting entry to excessively noisy areas. And then some interesting things, job observation and work practices, looking at how a work is done and determining, is there a way of doing that work in a more quiet way? And then, of course, equipment inspection and prevention. Often equipment gets noisier when it gets out of good condition. And this is a way of also ensuring that things are kept as quiet as possible. And then, of course, 6.5, personal protective equipment, where other measures further up the hierarchy do not prove to be fully effective. Clause 7 talks about hearing protection devices, and here again is there a reference to Z94.2, which identifies 4 methods of assessing hearing protection devices based on the noise levels and attenuation of the measurement measured results. So this again falls back to the administrator to select the appropriate hearing protection and offer options to the workers, train workers on the proper fit, care, use and care, and to monitor usage. Again, monitor usage, but not enforce, because the program administrator does not have direct line authority over the workers. And that's certainly a very purposeful thing. And then to advise workers on the selection of hearing protective devices and use if conditions change. So if the noise level changes, the hearing program administrator is obliged to stay on top of that. So there's another annex, which is Annex I, which provides, I think there's about 5 or 6 pages in Annex I, guidance on the types and features of hearing protection devices. Clause 8 is audiometric testing, and again, it does require, first of all, it starts with a declaration. Actually, this is where the interesting part of the standard reinforces the importance of identifying the fact that noise damage is permanent and that it is early evident by identifying the frequency at which the harm is occurring. And then recognizing that the damage increases over the years and spreads to the other frequencies other than the noise notch that where you first notice the hearing loss. So after this sort of opening statement in this clause, which is sort of reinforcing of the importance of what this is about, goes on to the requirement to use audiometric testing to determine changes in hearing, to compare annual. Now it recommends annual, but in Manitoba we've just gone to every 2 years. The standard is still requiring annual hearing testing, but to compare the worker's audiogram to the baseline to determine whether there has been any shift. So the technician then, who is required to by the organization to provide the hearing of the audiometry, is responsible to the program administrator. So the program administrator gets the test results, and if they if the administrator is the audiometric technician, then they maintain the results. If the audiometry is contracted out, then the person who performs the hearing testing would report to the hearing protection administrator. So again, the administrator has an obligation to make sure that people are necessarily trained, and in Manitoba we have a credentialing process, and verify that testing equipment is maintained and calibrated, and then document any situation that could compromise test reliability. So for example, if a person has a wax occlusion, if their ear canal is blocked because of wax buildup, that result that was obtained would not be reliable. So it's the obligation of the technician to identify those situations. So the technician, whether it's the program administrator or a contracted service, has an obligation to keep the records filed securely and confidential, because these are equivalent to medical records, and then provide guidance in the selection, fit, use, and condition of hearing protection, and provide worker training. So again, this is an interesting thing. The technician has a role in doing these things, but that has to be done in the context of the knowledge of the hearing loss prevention program in the workplace. So this would also change the relationship between the audiometric technician and the administrator to make sure that these things that are the technician's responsibility can be done correctly and adequately. Okay, so the administrator then gets the results of the workers who are a list of the workers who are experiencing a noise-induced hearing loss, or a general analysis of the success of the hearing loss prevention program in preventing hearing loss. So the excuse me, this is where the authority having jurisdiction, the government in this case, the Workplace Safety and Health Division, has a general requirement for how this information is provided. And the obligation in legislation is, if the hearing loss meets a certain criteria, then it has to be referred for a follow-up to an audiologist or a physician. Clause 9, hazard communication. This again, it requires the organization to post at levels where the noise is high. The standard identifies 85 dBA to warn people that this is a noisy area, and then to instruct workers to wear their hearing protection devices in the noisy areas. So the hearing protection devices have to be where they are needed to be used. There's also an obligation to make sure workers are familiar with the layout of the facility, to identify noise emitting equipment and noise exposure tasks in the work area. So again, training to understand the meaning of the the signs and locations. So this is another feature, is that the training requirement is at all levels of the standard. So training shall be incorporated, this is part 10, in all HLPP elements to inform workers of the purpose and elements of the program, and then provide annual training, provide sort of, so here we go, sorry. The training has to be provided before the worker works in the noisy area. So this is like WMIS, you have to have the training before you go and get exposed to the chemical. So the idea is it's anticipatory. The training also has to make sure that workers understand the effect of noise on hearing and the risks that are posed by the specific noise levels that are present in the workplace. And then, of course, the use, care, and selection of hearing protection devices, their obligation to participate in audiometric testing, and procedures, or processes for reporting concerns about noise. Remember, that was identified as an expectation on the workers. Okay, so Plan, Do, Check, Act. So at this point in time, there is a requirement for the documentation of the elements against the goals and responsibilities. So these records are kept. The records include task descriptions and list of the people who are involved in the hearing protection, the list of workers and their job titles, the results of exposure and area measurements. So these are the sound level survey results, and then engineering or administrative control strategies that have been put in place in the workplace. Then an inventory of the hearing protection that's offered in the workplace, the strategies for communicating hazard, for communicating the presence of hazard noises, and then the kind of things that are reactive or after the fact, the analysis of the hearing testing results, and then training records and the results of the annual review. So the records must be maintained for the duration of employment of the person and for a minimum of 10 years. So workers, the kind of records that would be maintained that relate to the workers' participation would be the audiometric testing record, the record of training provided, the record of the hearing protection device use, and noise exposure and fit testing results for the hearing protection devices. So the transfer of records then is required by local jurisdiction. And so in Manitoba, we report to workers' compensation if the worker files a claim. We also provide, and we don't provide it, but we provide to the employer, and then the employer provides to the authority the activity that occurs within the program. Okay, so now we're at the continuous improvement stage. You're monitoring the performance against the goals and objectives that were set in the plan phase, and you are then monitoring that you are determining that the monitoring is performed in accordance with the requirements of the mothership, which is Z405001. And the hearing program administrator then evaluates the effectiveness against the requirements. So there's another table in the legislation which provides some direction on how to properly conduct a review of the program, and then there's a separate annex which informs people not on what assessment strategies to be used, but what options are available for assessing the performance. So this is the section that's not common in any of the other management system standards, but it acknowledges that sometimes noise exposure in a workplace is a bit of a challenge. And one of the challenges are identified as challenges to the workplace and challenges to the worker. So one of the interesting identification is intentionally loud noises at workplaces. You know, when you think about bars and, you know, sort of any kind of socials, anytime where you're in an environment where the idea is to crank up the noise as loud as you can. So how to deal with that? And often the objection to the wearing of hearing protection in those environments, for example, by servers, say it interferes with their ability to communicate with the patrons of the organization. So there's an interesting thing in the literature, which identifies that this, in fact, is a myth, that it is not harder to hear, but easier to hear communication in an intentionally loud noise workplace when the proper hearing protection is provided. Another workplace challenge is transient or seasonal workers. If you've got a labor-ready workforce who get assigned for a week here and a week there, or a day here and a day there, how do you manage the emphasis on, first of all, preventing hearing loss in those people in a transient workforce, and how do you create the kind of records that would be necessary to determine their hearing health status? Worker challenges, workers wearing hearing aids. Do you not wear the hearing aid in the workplace in a noisy environment? And how to deal with workers with a pre-existing hearing loss. So again, there's an excellent annex which addresses the safety concerns for workers with hearing loss. So that's the 13 sections of the standard. There's also an additional, this is a listing, what's going to follow now of the annexes. Annex A is an application of the Plan, Do, Check, Act model, which is the methodology from Z 45001. Annex B on autotoxicity explains how chemicals can impact on hearing loss, and whether or not, what kind of chemicals to be aware of if they're present in your workplace. Could there be a synergistic effect? So in the standard in Annex E is a sample of how to do a noise map. You can identify by noisy areas as red or yellow and green in terms of the level of exposure. And again, remember from hazard communication, any place you have an area where the noise exceeds 85 decibels, you have to sign it and communicate the hazard. Annex G provides that option methodology for conducting a risk assessment and how to set priorities for doing risk assessments in the workplace. Annex H is a very useful explanation of the difference between DBA and DBC frequencies when we are looking at doing a noise assessment. Column I is the long annex on the types and features of hearing protection devices. J and K then are the kind of unusual additions. One is safety concerns for workers with hearing loss, and K, management of noise exposure in underwater environments. And you can bet that there was some person who does underwater work, for example, the divers and who do welding underground, present on that technical committee to make sure that their specific concern was identified and managing it and outlined in an annex. Okay, we're going to give you some opportunity to answer the questions. I've kind of rattled through this all quite quickly, but before going on, I want to make sure you know about the CSA communities of interest. The link to become a member is there. And the way this is set up is it's strictly focused. There's a whole area that's focused on occupational health and safety. And it shows the sort of stakeholders who would be necessarily and interested and involved in this community. And so what the advantage of joining the community of interest is it gives you access to any standard by jurisdiction that's referenced in legislation. So for example, there are, I believe, about 85 CSA standards that are referenced in Manitoba's legislation. And once it becomes a a regulated standard because of its incorporation by reference, it has to be freely available. So there's a way of linking through the communities of interest to any of the standards that are present in the workplace. Also, there is a link to be able to access 45,001. Now, this is not a direct link to the standard, but CSA contracted for and has published an implementation guide. And in the implementation guide, set out in boxes are all of the requirements of 45,001. The reason why Canada cannot make it available for free is there are other standards development organizations in the world whose revenue depends on the sale of standards, right? So, Canada doesn't want to interfere with those organizations' ability, but we also want to make it available to people because it is the mothership standard for all of our Z1000 series. So the workaround is to provide it as an implementation guide for free. Okay, so that's it for me. I'm going to answer your questions.
So Norma,
Yes,
so far we got one question on the chat from
Okay.
Deborah. How would the legislation deal with a non-traditional situation where the employer does not own the workplace or set the working environment and conditions?
Yeah. Okay, so the issue is who is the organization that employs the workers, right? It's the organization that has the responsibility. So in Z1000, in Z 45,001, the work is defined is anything that is done on behalf of the organization, right? So if I am doing something that is assigned to me as a task by an organization, then it is considered to be work for which the organization is responsible for ensuring my safety, right? So the issue of whether the organization owns the workplace is a non-issue, right? Because it's the workplace environment that the organization would have responsibility for controlling. Does that help?
Great, thank you. So anyone have more questions for Norma? Would you please send it on the chat here? Then we will try to answer it. Okay, in here, listening devices, consider a hazard or what part of the legislation can help to encourage an employer to not allow to use?
Okay, so first of all, I just want to be clear. We can't call a standard legislation unless it's incorporated by reference, right? It becomes a tool to help an organization comply with what the law requires. So that whole annex on hearing protection devices is really quite useful. So I'm just going to suggest that that might be the basis upon which the organization could make decisions about the appropriateness of the inline the use of this protective equipment. I'm just trying to see if I can pull up the annex itself. But that's, again, that's the advantage of this. The standard does not deal with things that are obligatory on the employer other than voluntarily because it's a standard. The other thing is that there's two levels of the standard. One is the what's called normative section. In order to complain conformance with the standard, you have to meet the requirements that are in the main body of the standard. So additionally, if you want to add additional information or recommendations, that is where you have the informative sections, which are the annex. This is the more how to, yeah.
Norma, sorry for
Yeah.
interrupt you. Michelle put another chat say, oh, she's talking about the music ear pods, not the PPE.
Right, about the,
Not the PPE, about the
about,
in-ear listening devices.
listening
Music
device,
one,
right? Yeah.
not the one about the
Oh,
personal.
sorry, okay, yeah, so that's an interesting thing. Now that would be addressed by the rules and procedures of the employer, right? And the employer could make those decisions, the organization could make those decisions on a variety of bases. For example, you could determine or hypothesize that the person's listening to music while they do their job could be a safety factor, right? If you're a flag person, you're standing out on the highway and you're listening to Def Leppard while you're supposed to be listening to the traffic, right? Or for the traffic, that could be an issue where the organization could legitimately determine that it would put the worker at risk if it was allowed. So the process then would be to identify from that situation, whether or not the worker was at increased risk, and then have policies and procedures that would govern that use. But again, that wouldn't be dealt with in specifically in this standard. Yeah.
So we have another question here. How can we find the implementation guide?
For 45,001? For
Kevin, would you mind to clarify your questions? Is Kevin still here with us?
okay. So anyway, I can answer if it's 45,001.
Sure. Yeah.
Join the community of interest, and you're going to send out the slides so that URL is going to be on it.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
And yeah. Okay. So then you just Google. You can Google in two ways, or not Google, but you can search in two ways. One is you can search Manitoba. And if in fact a standard is referenced in Manitoba, you will have view access, free access. The other way is to search by the standard name, because Manitoba and no jurisdiction in Canada references 45,001. That's my objective in life to change this, but not successful yet. So you could search 45,001 and it will haul up the implementation guide, and then you can access that. It's a view access. Again, you can't print them, but you can access them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, you're right. You have any questions?
Good.
Awesome.
Nothing succeeds like success.
Okay. You guys have any questions for Norma before we wrap it up?
So just if I can make a parting shot, there are, at this point in time, I think 14 of the Z1000 series. So when you get the slideshow, if there's interest in any of the other standards specifically, the ergonomic standard is up for review, the emergency management and business continuity standard, like these standards grow and change. So if there's interest in any of the future or in the developments of some of these standards, just let me know and I can either get the information to you or make a presentation for you.
Great. So it seems no more question for you, Norma, but on behalf of the Occupational Health Center, thank you so much for doing this informative session for us. As you always said, the CSA standard is so important, and then we really want to get those information out to much as more people to know that standard, right? So that's great. I really appreciate you spending the time to doing that presentation for us, and also thank you all of you to joining the the session with us too as well. So I will send you the recorded session and with the slide as well. So yeah, we will see you next session. The next session will be in on June 20th. So we will have more information to send out later soon. Okay, great. Have yourself a great day. Take care, everyone. Bye.
Bye.